Bonjour, bonsoir. Alors, je suis Karim Beniclef, professeur à la faculté de droit et chercheur au Centre de recherche en droit public de l'Université de Montréal. Bienvenue au laboratoire de cyberjustice et à la troisième et dernière conférence du cycle Bandung 2.0, Diplomatie occidentale et essor des Suds. Après avoir reçu Guillaume Long et Jean de Glignasti, je suis très heureux d'accueillir aujourd'hui le professeur Martin Hart-Landsberg et M. Renaud Lambert. Welcome to the Université de Montréal, and thank you for being with us this afternoon. As I said, our exchange today with Martin and Renaud is the last of our conference cycle. What have we learned so far? First, it is important to appreciate the gravity of the current tension in the world today. Whether it is the war in Ukraine, the conflict in the Middle East, the territorial dispute in the China Sea, or the protectionist trend, etc. The causes of these tensions are obviously multiple, but our speakers so far seem to agree on the fact that the United States, not intending to cede its preeminent position and feeling threatened, is using economic tools to, in turn, threaten other states, and, of course, military gesticulation in the classic neoconservative playbook are intended to intimidate and contain states that refuse subjection. This situation is, of course, dangerous, since our guest also noted that it is concomitant to the revocation of diplomacy as a crucial tool of dialogue. While the Americans and the Soviets continue to communicate during the Cold War, the actual US administration believes that it can avoid dialogue with the Russians. Westerners are still driven by the software of the Second World War, made up of alliances, the designation of a common enemy, its maximum demonization, reductio ad Hitlerum. Everybody is Adolf Hitler, it's always Munich also. Good and evil, democracy against authoritarian regime, and by the way, a cliché dismantled by Eugénie Merriot in an excellent book illustrating the porosity of the border between these two regimes. In short, a Manichaean that the actual context no longer justifies. Our guest highlighted the lack of historical culture of current leaders and a denial of the realities that have been emerging for some time and which illustrate the loss of influence of the West. A denial of realities which cannot fail to alarm and which reflects the disconnection of the educated classes. This loss of Western influence does not imply erasure or a decline towards insignificance. It should, on the contrary, shake up our leaders and push them to seek ways of cooperation and collaboration that can benefit everyone. It should lead to healthy questioning. The military or economic threat will not return us to the statu quo ante. And the position of the Global South regarding the conflict of Ukraine is very revealing. It condemns the Russian invasion, contrary to international law, refuses the application of unilateral economic sanctions decided by others, and which are also contrary to international law. So a multi-vector diplomacy is emerging, diplomatie multivectorielle, which also intends to promote real multilateralism. A very clear conclusion from our previous guest and observer in contact with reality is that the American unipolar moment is over, and it has been dilapidated by the hubris and inconsistency of the Washington blob. As Andrew Bacevich of the Quincy Institute noted, restraint is the way to go. The United States must take care of itself, contribute to international life as the powerful actor that it remains, stop giving lessons that it does not respect itself, and put an end to this military adventurism, which since 9/11 has cost the US Treasury more than $8 trillion, according to Brown University Cost of War project. I will leave it to our guests to continue the reflection on the contribution of the countries of the South to this new geopolitical configuration which are emerging. But a very short word of presentation. So, Renaud Lambert, après avoir travaillé à France Inter comme reporter dans l'émission Là-bas, si j'y suis de Daniel Mermet, Renaud a rejoint le Monde diplomatique en 2010. Le Monde diplomatique, si vous voulez connaître la réalité des choses, c'est le journal à lire. Il y a couvert l'Amérique latine avant d'être chargé de l'Asie en novembre 2023. Il suit par ailleurs les dossiers liés à l'économie. Et Renaud Lambert est l'un des co-auteurs du documentaire Les Nouveaux chiens de garde, que j'ai revu avec grand plaisir il y a quelques jours, en fait, et où j'ai bien ri aussi, ce qui n'est jamais négligeable. Martin Hart-Landsberg. Martin is Professor Emeritus of Economics at Lewis and Clark College in Portland. He's the author of 7 books on issues related to globalization and the political economy of East Asia. He's also a member of the board of directors of the Korea Policy Institute and chair of the Oregon chapter of the National Writers Union. Thibault Biscahie, au centre, chercheur postdoctoral au Centre de recherche en droit public, animera la conversation pendant 60-75 minutes environ, et une période de questions d'une quinzaine de minutes suivra. Merci beaucoup. Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you to the Cyber Justice Lab for hosting this roundtable. Hello, everyone. Hello, Renaud.
Hi.
Hello, Martin. So welcome to Montreal. Welcome to the Centre de recherche en droit public. We're very happy to have you today for this roundtable, which you have decided to title The Return of the South, Myth, Realities, and Their Military Implications. So we're going to discuss questions of development, the meaning of the South, the meanings of the South, perhaps, in plural, and also the North reaction to what some have called the rise or the return of the South. But before diving into these questions, I would like maybe to switch very briefly to French with you, Renaud, pour discuter de ce numéro de Manière de voir qui est paru à l'été 2024 et qui était intitulé « Des non-alignés aux BRICS, le Sud existe-t-il ?» Alors, qu'est-ce qui a motivé le thème de ce numéro de Manière de voir, le choix de ce thème, et qu'est-ce qui a également motivé le choix des contributions que ce numéro contient?
Tout d'abord, merci. Merci pour l'invitation de votre laboratoire, le centre de recherche. C'est un plaisir d'être ici. Il se trouve que parmi les aspects les plus sympathiques de la visite, il y a eu la possibilité pour moi non seulement de découvrir tous les gens qui nous avaient invités, mais aussi Martin, avec lequel j'avais échangé. Martin collabore au Monde diplomatique, mais on ne s'était vu que par Zoom. Et enfin, on a pu se serrer la main, ce qui n'était pas l'un des aspects les plus désagréables de notre venue ici. Alors, ce Manière de voir, la publication Manière de voir est une publication bimestrielle du Monde diplomatique qui a pour vocation de rentrer dans plus de détails dans une thématique donnée. Et pour alimenter les sommaires de ces manières de voir, nous puisons dans les archives du Monde diplomatique. Le Monde diplomatique, c'est un journal ancien maintenant, il a été créé en 1954. Nous avons des archives très profondes qui nous permettent d'offrir un regard en général très large sur des thématiques et de montrer que les questions que l'on s'oppose aujourd'hui sont des questions que l'on s'est souvent posées par le passé, même si la mémoire nous fait parfois défaut. Et c'est particulièrement important pour la question du Sud, dont l'émergence actuelle n'est pas la première. Alors, qu'est-ce qui nous a amené à choisir cette thématique ? Eh bien, tout d'abord, les discours ambiants sur l'émergence d'un Sud. L'apogée des BRICS, la montée en puissance de ce groupement de pays qui va grandissant au fil des années. Des discours aussi sur la dédollarisation, l'idée que l'un des piliers du monde tel qu'il s'est construit après 1944 et la conférence de Bretton Woods, que ce pilier était en train de chanceler, était remis en cause par des pays dont on ne savait pas exactement lesquels c'était, et puis l'émergence de ce concept de Sud global. Et donc, l'envie nous est venue de nous interroger sur quel est ce Sud global, existe-t-il, s'il existe, que veut-il? Et puis d'abord, qu'est-ce que le Sud? Et à cette question, on a essayé de répondre dans le manière de voir en réalisant plusieurs cartes que vous ne verrez pas à l'endroit où vous vous trouvez ici. Mais ces cartes sont construites à partir de variables différentes. Parce que, évidemment, lorsqu'on parle des pays du Sud, le constat que l'on est obligé de faire assez rapidement, c'est que la définition du Sud n'est pas une définition géographique. la Chine fait partie du Sud, l'Algérie fait partie de ce Sud, or ils sont dans l'hémisphère nord du planisphère. Nous avons donc cherché ailleurs une définition de ce que pouvait être ce Sud. Et nous sommes assez rapidement tournés vers les Nations Unies. Nous avons essayé de voir si les résolutions autour de conflits importants, qui avaient semblé diviser la planète, permettaient de ventiler les pays en fonction de leur vote dans différentes résolutions, et si cette ventilation ressemblait à ce que chacun d'entre nous serait sans doute d'accord pour définir comme le Sud. Donc nous avons regardé les résolutions sur l'Ukraine, et ça ne fonctionne pas. Les résolutions sur le conflit palestinien, ça ne fonctionne pas. Mais nous sommes tombés sur une résolution qui date de décembre 2023, qui, elle, permet une ventilation presque chimiquement pure des votes en fonction de l'appartenance ou non des pays à ce que l'on appelle le Sud ou ce qu'on appelle le Nord. Et cette résolution, étonnamment, concerne la question de la fiscalité. Est-ce que des institutions multilatérales devraient se charger de piloter la réflexion mondiale sur la justice fiscale? Et la ventilation des votes des pays à l'Assemblée générale des Nations Unies autour de cette question permet d'obtenir une cartographie très précise des pays qui appartiennent au Sud, ils ont voté en faveur de la résolution, et des pays qui appartiennent au Nord, qui, en cœur, ont voté contre cette résolution. Et pour terminer cette première prise de parole, il me semble que cette mise en carte du Sud montre que, et c'est un peu ce que l'on va chercher à suggérer aujourd'hui avec Martin, montre que la question du Sud est avant tout une question liée à l'économie et liée au développement.
Okay, so well, precisely, let's switch back to English. And can you give us, perhaps, Martin, a sense of what this development progress is today? Like, how will you define it?
So two things. First, I really appreciate being invited and sharing the platform with Renaud, and I thank you all. And second, I want to apologize for my lack of French. I feel like if I could, then we could all be moving forward in a way that would be easier for everyone. So please forgive me. The World Bank has a poverty number, and as an economist, I have to give you numbers so you see that I'm legitimate. And the way they work out poverty is something called purchasing power parity. So they take a basket of goods, say, you know, how much does it cost you to buy food and transportation, and they take the price of that, coming from the US, I'll say in dollars, and then they go to other countries and they try and find a similar basket of goods, and they say, how much does it cost, say, Angola has the kwanza, how much does it cost in kwanzas in Angola, how much does it cost in the US, and then they make an exchange rate. And they say, this is kind of equivalent to this, so the cost here is kind of equivalent to here, and they translate this amount in dollars. So the international poverty line, they have 3 of them, which tells you it's a serious problem because you wouldn't need 3. The highest one is $685 a day, which works out to $2,500 a year. It's not a lot of money with equivalent dollar amount. 45% of the world's population is below that. The very lowest level is $2.15 a day, which is $785 a year, and about 10% of the world's population is below that. There has not been any improvement in the poverty rate since 2015. Okay. And unfortunately, what we're heading for is a serious debt crisis in much of Africa and much of Latin America. And to give you a feeling for that, excuse me, if you may all know all this very well, but since 2015, you probably know the world economy has not grown particularly fast. And for third world countries or countries of the global south, I think we're still juggling these terms, their exports have been limited. Most of them are exporting raw materials, primary commodities. That's what they export. In a functioning capitalist economy with minimal restrictions, you're free to import anything you want. You want a foreign good, you go buy it if you can. And so what's happened is that as third world countries have been growing since 2015, their exports have not kept up with the import demand. You have, if you want to build industry, you need machinery, equipment, raw materials. If you have wealthy people who want to buy all sorts of things, imports grow. Now, how do you pay for imports if you don't have the exports? You have to have hard currency, international reserves. No one wants to get a huge amount of Angolan kwanzas. They don't know what they would do with it. They want dollars. So how does the third world continue to grow when its trade continues to be in deficit? The World Bank encourages, and the IMF encourages it, to borrow from the private capital markets. So whether it's hedge funds, whether it's pension funds, whether it's banks, whether it's corporations, and so they have. And their debt was growing and growing. And then we had the pandemic. And what happens during the pandemic? Prices of energy go up, prices of food go up, suddenly import costs soar. Countries wanted to keep inflation down, so they raised interest rates. About 40% of third world loans are on flexible rates, so they ratchet up. And all of a sudden now, countries can't pay their debts. Bolivia has, when it was doing well, $15 billion in international reserves. They have 1.5 billion now. I was reading a report that the whole aviation sector may close down because they can't import fuel. Many countries in Africa are already at a point where the interest payments are far greater than healthcare and education. So what do? And here's where the international institutions become important, the IMF and the World Bank. The World Bank says, if you can't pay, we'll make you a loan, but their interest rates are high. And in fact, for countries that haven't paid, they have a penalty rate that's even higher. And how do you solve a balance of payments problem in a capitalist economy following the rules? You have to reduce people's demand for imports. And how do you reduce people's demand for imports? You make them poorer. If you had subsidies on food, and that meant people were eating too much, you get rid of the subsidies so they won't demand as much food if it's imported. If you have subsidies on transportation, you cut those to reduce the demand for transportation. And you push your economy, if it's a real debt crisis, into a recession. Lowering demand, creating a surplus if you can, and paying debts. And that's where we're at in the third world now, in the global south now. We're on the verge of another crisis in Latin America and in most of Africa.
Renaud, could you perhaps, against this background, summarize the general discourse on development and as we hear it or read it in mainstream media, for instance?
Yeah, because I'm switching back to English as well, but I've got a joker card given to me by Martin to fall back on French if I get too tired with the English. You'll have to forgive me for this if I do. So the picture Martin has presented us raises the question, what's wrong with the recipes that were given these countries? And they all are based on this idea that development is a linear process, pretty much like a race, and people would start at different times, and people all run, and they get to the point whenever they have run the distance they needed to run. So European countries started their development earlier, so they've reached a higher stage of development. And third world countries, well, they started later when they became independent. So just they have to buy their time, but when their time has come, they will be developed. Now, this is the discourse, and it's not really satisfactory because it doesn't fit reality, the reality that Martin has depicted. And I want to raise one example to suggest that, in fact, it doesn't really work like this. And the example is that of Paraguay, a Latin American country. In the middle of the 19th century, the whole of South America was controlled under the thumb of the imperial power of the time, which was London, the United Kingdom. And the way they had been inserted in the world system, the world economic system, was that these countries were responsible for sending out raw material to the center of the world economy, London, And in turn, they purchased finished goods, industrial goods, from Europe. Now, there was one country that tried to do it differently, and that was Paraguay. In 1814, Gaspar de Francia came to power, and he decided to build a strong state, a dirigist state. It was quite a muscular way of doing it. He got rid of the oligarchy, but not to implement another type of oligarchy in order to redistribute wealth. He implemented protectionist measures, so goods didn't come to the country, they had to be produced locally. And by chance, when he died in 1840, his successors followed up with the same policies. There was an agrarian reform, there was wealth redistribution, and when foreign travelers traveled to Paraguay, the conclusions they came to is that there was no poverty, there was no hunger in Paraguay, there were no beggars in Paraguay. Paraguay was the first country to develop a railway system. They had their own shipyards. They developed a steel industry, or the beginning of a steel industry. They even managed to send scholars to Europe to be trained. Now, that didn't please London so much. So London organized an alliance between Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina to declare war on Paraguay. And that's the Triple Alliance War that started in 1865. The war lasted 5 years, and in 1870, when the war was over, Paraguay had lost 60% of their population. 9 out of 10 men were killed. The infrastructures had been destroyed, and Paraguay suddenly discovered the pleasures of free trade. Today, Paraguay has a poverty level over 27%. So I think what the Paraguay example teaches us is that development in Europe, in Western countries, and underdevelopment are two processes that go hand in hand. The development of the center requires the underdevelopment of the periphery. This has led to various trends of scholarship, especially one that is called the dependency theory. And it shows that states in the periphery tend to depend on the production of other countries. To this day, Martin mentioned it, southern countries, most of the time, need to import products from the center of the world economy. And they send out their raw material. As you know, there's less value added in raw material. That dependency is also reflected in the position of the oligarchy, which is at the helm of these countries. These oligarchies don't live in their countries. They live their mentality, the way they dress, the way they furnish their houses, the way they send their kids to be taught is in other countries. They might live in the south, but they think of themselves as belonging to the north. And that dependency means that when it starts raining in the north, there's a storm rising in the south, because they have become dependent on other economies, on economies that they do not control.
Martin, one might retort to this argument that some countries which used to be poor managed to catch up the traditional way, and some people will, assume that this is the case of South Korea, for instance, which has seen this kind of miracle in terms of development and industrialization. So, do you think this is an apt example?
Well, it's an example of the power of dependency theory, in a way. When I first started to study South Korea, and the same thing would be true for Taiwan, some of the other countries in Asia, there was a sense that, as you said, Thibault, that Korea's rise showed dependency theory was wrong, because dependency theory says if you connect to the global economy, you will be underdeveloped. And those relationships will keep you from developing. And so here's South Korea, which is exporting. And they said, see, exports, you need to be part of the world economy. South Korea shows that you can do this. And it's a free market miracle. It shows that free trade works and let the market work and be open to the global economy. Most mainstream economists live in a theoretical world because it's nice and pure and ideological. If you actually study what happened in South Korea, you see that it did nothing as the sort of mainstream or orthodox economists would say would produce development. And let me give you an example. A man named Park Chung-hee made a military coup in 1961 in South Korea. And he actually made the coup because there was a movement of South Korean youth and North Korean youth who wanted to meet and talk about reunification. And since the South Korean military had just fought in the Korean War, they were fearful what would happen. So Park Chung-hee, who was studying North Korea, made a coup. And Park Chung-hee had been an officer in the Japanese military when Japan had colonized Korea. So he was very used to planning, and he had studied North Korea. That was his intelligence position. So the first thing he did was he took ownership of the entire banking system. Okay? And then he created a set of ministries that somewhat mimicked Japan. The Economic Planning Board, for example, had complete control over all foreign loans. You could not borrow money without permission from the Economic Planning Bureau. You could not take money out of the country. If you did, there was a death sentence without approval from the Economic Planning Board. Foreign direct investment, multinationals, had to get approval from the Economic Planning Board. In Korea's development, while it did allow multinationals to come in, they never let a multinational come in that would produce a domestic consumer product. It was only to help spur industry. Okay? They created a Ministry of Trade and Information, and they made every company join a producer association. And you couldn't join and produce unless the Ministry of Trade and Industry gave you permission to be a member. So we know Hyundai has cars, Samsung never got cars. Why? Because the ministry said, you don't have anything new to bring to the table in terms of technology. You can't do it. Right? They set up free trade. They set up industrial zones, and they said, okay, we're going to push exports. All right, but we're not going to allow imports to come in unless we want to. They promoted it as free trade, but you couldn't import without a license. And the Korean government came up with all these wonderful things like area diversification measures. So you know why there was no Japanese cars sold in Korea? There was no Japanese electronics sold in Korea? Because the area diversification measure said, you importers, you can't bring in those goods because we want to diversify. And the diversification means no imports from this country. So South Korea used this tremendous protection of limiting foreign investment, controlling imports, and then the government, because it controlled the banking system, would say to companies, you can expand rapidly. Like, for example, Hyundai had construction. You did a good job. Now you can do cement. You did a good job. Now you can do auto. All you need is a little capital. We'll provide the funds. And of course, having those funds gave the state a lot of power because you had to do what the state said. And if you didn't, there was one big company that refused to give kickbacks. It was very corrupt, but it refused to give kickbacks. And so the head of South Korea called in all the loans. This company that was producing in 18 countries, had 30 or 40,000 employees, went bankrupt overnight, and all the assets were given to other companies, right? It was a very powerful planning system. So what about Hyundai? So the government said, we want a shipping industry. And they didn't have one, but Hyundai said, okay, they said to Hyundai, you build the ships, we'll make them profitable. And Hyundai was able to take all its engineers from cement, construction, auto, and apply them to shipbuilding. They built the ships. There wasn't an immediate demand. The government said all Korean goods will be shipped by Hyundai ships. Right? Now, we have to be clear that this worked for South Korea because the US wanted it to work. Another country, like Guatemala, says, we want to have land reform, and the US comes in and overthrows the government. But in Taiwan, the nationalists came to Taiwan, They took control of all the Japanese properties. They took the banking system. They put in controls. The US said, that's good, because we're in competition with the People's Republic of China. South Korea, you're in competition with North Korea. So we want you to succeed. And because they wanted them to succeed, they opened their markets so Korea and Taiwan could export. They didn't close them off. They allowed them to put restrictions on foreign investment. They allowed the state to grow very big and powerful. And that's why those countries grew. That's not a refutation of dependency theory. It shows that if the US didn't want that to happen, it wouldn't have happened. But there was a particular historical moment, a political moment, that the US was willing to grant. And in that sense, we have to say that US planners know what development takes. It takes a strong state, it takes planning. And of course, in the case of both Korea and Taiwan, they were dictatorial states. And the struggle was, how do you democratize a powerful planning state? How do you make it work for people? And that's a challenge for us. I don't think we have successful models of that. But these experiences are experiences that don't refute dependency theory, but they show the importance of capacities and the importance of these dominant countries that pick and choose the context in which they allow for development to take place.
Can I chip in on this? Yeah, because when you were explaining planification in South Korea, it really reminded me of what Perón did in Argentina in 45. And I think it was 55, there was a coup to prevent him from doing this. And the other example that came to mind was the Conference of London in 1951 or 53
Yes.
To deal with the German debt. After the war, Germany was crushed with debt. And the creditor countries organized this conference to see how they were going to deal with it. And they offered conditions that all the indebted countries we talked about earlier on would dream of. For instance, Germany was allowed to repay only a certain amount of whatever it managed to export, which means that it was allowed to keep some international reserves. There was the moment when the debt was due was postponed. I don't have all the details, but I mean, really, these were conditions that other countries would dream of. For instance, Greece, when it was in the midst of its own debt crisis. And why did the creditor countries allow West Germany, to benefit such a deal? Well, it was because West Germany was supposed to be a bulwark against the rise of communism, which again is testament to the fact that you are dependent on what strong countries want of you.
Well, as you both made clear, the development of the North largely depended on the underdevelopment of the South, and also on the use of protectionist measures that they deny the right of southern countries to use. But since we're talking about this exploitation of southern countries, perhaps we can actually start talking about the South, the notion of the South, and perhaps draw a distinction between what we call
Before we do that,
yes.
I just want to interrupt for a second, because this is something I think is kind of important maybe when we get to the South, but talking about the developed countries and their experience. I don't want to belabor it, but in 1950, during the Depression, the developed capitalist countries put all sorts of restrictions on trade and currency movements. And during World War II, they did the same. They didn't want their gold to go. They didn't want people to buy their stuff. They wanted for it. And the US said at the end in 1950, we want you to open up. We want to be able to sell our goods to you all. And the European countries said, if we open up, because our industries are so damaged, we're going to run a huge trade deficit, and we're going to have to deal with that, and we're going to have to repress our economies, and there's strong lefts in many European countries, and we can't do this. And in fact, we already have controls on, we're not going to take them off. And so finally an agreement was reached where the US said, okay, we accept this, because they didn't want these countries, they didn't want the communist movements in these countries to get more powerful, and they didn't want them to begin to ally with the Soviet Union. So they worked out something called the European Payments Union. And it's a very interesting relationship that I think speaks a lot to the way I think third world countries have to start thinking. What did they do? The European Payments Union said, we have controlled plans, but here's what we're going to do. Say a Swedish company wants to buy a tractor from Germany. They would go to the Swedish central bank and pay in their krona. The German, if it's proved, the German would then get paid in Deutschmarks from their central bank. And trade could go on in Europe among these countries. Each month, these countries totaled up their overall balance of payments with all the other countries, and they did it relative to what's called international a bank of settlements that acted sort of like a central bank. So these countries were not in debt to any other country, but to this central body. And the way the central body operated was, if you had a small balance of payments debt, they would just give you a loan, which means you could continue to grow because you didn't worry about the lack of hard currency. If you were a surplus country, they didn't give you all the gold, they gave you part of it and credited the other. And what happened then is that you couldn't just take your currency and go get dollars and import anything. You had to buy from other European countries in a controlled way. And these European countries kept their currencies unconvertible to the dollar until 1958. And they only by 1956 did they actually drop some of their internal controls on whether you can import without a government permission. So if you take developed capitalist countries and you say they needed from 1950 to 1958 to control their trade and keep their currencies inconvertible in order to be confident to open up, what are we expecting from third world countries? How does the system work? Again, the US gave a huge loan to the International Bank of Settlements to start the process. And the US let these countries export to the US to earn gold, even while accepting that they would restrict imports from the US. This was, in fact, a joint delinking from the global economy to build up collectively Europe. And when you look and see these experiences and say, under what conditions do countries develop? It is not the way the IMF says, it's not the way the World Bank says, it's not the way the mainstream economists say. And one last thing. When I was in Korea, back to this free market, just to tell you a story, I was staying at Yonsei University, which is one of the well-known universities in South Korea, in their guest house. This was in the early 90s. And there was a delegation, an IMF delegation from countries, former Soviet countries and some African countries to learn about the free market miracle of South Korea. And so in the evenings, I was doing my stuff, they were doing it, and then at the end, oh, what are you learning? And they said, oh, Korea is this free market country, they just welcome foreign investment, they free trade. I was kind of horrified, but so after 2 nights of this, I said, oh, who's your professor? And they mentioned, Professor Kim. So I sought out Professor Kim, and I knocked on the door of his office, and I introduced myself. I'm a professor, I'm interested in Korea, I hear you're talking to these people, they're telling me this. Humbly, that's not how I understand it. He pulls me into his office, shuts the door, and he says, the IMF has this story, and they tell our dean that this is the story, and the dean tells me that this is the story. He says, you're very well informed, that's not the experience, but this is what I teach, this is the program. And that's how the IMF works. That's how the ideology gets promoted.
Renaud, Martin is using the term third world, and indeed this was the term that was used after World War II to depict what the South, or what southern countries were. Today we talk more about the global South. How do you, what kind of distinction do you draw between what we call the South today and what we used to call the South after World War II?
Yeah, that's one of the demonstrations we tried to make in that publication, really to try and see what differences can be pointed at between what the South used to be, how it presented itself, and what it is today. So that first South, the old one, let's say, like as you said, it comes about in this general independence movement after the Second World War. And one of the key moments for its rise is the Bandung Conference in 1955. And that Bandung Conference, it gathered in Indonesia something like 30 representatives from newly independent countries or states that were still fighting for their independence. Now, one of the projects in Bandung was to say, colonialism is dead. This is over. We are turning a page. But Sukarno, who was president in Indonesia, he made the opening speech. And he said this, which I want to quote. He said, "We are often told that colonialism is dead. Let us not be fooled, or even lulled to sleep by the misleading formulation. I assure you that colonialism is very much alive. Modern colonialism takes the form of economic control exercised by a foreign country. It is a skillful and determined enemy. It does not easily let go of its booty." What happens from Bandung is the idea that political independence is not full emancipation. To be free, countries need to be independent from an economic perspective. And little by little, as they make their own experience, Sukarno, whom I've just mentioned, used to be quite close to the United States in 1955 when he made that speech. And he ended up sharing power very close to the Communist Party before he was exterminated by a coup in 1965. So there was a process whereby political thought led to a radicalization of the idea that the system, the economic system, needed to be toppled. Free trade, capitalism represented a barrier for all these third world countries for them to develop. They needed something else. They needed the protectionism that Martin has been talking about. And this process, which I'm running through in a very fast fashion, I think came to a climax in 1973 with a resolution passed in the General Assembly of the United Nations called Resolution for a New International Economic Order. And that resolution really is a climax in the organized claim that we needed a new economic system whereby states would be allowed to control the sale of natural resources, a system where there would be limits to market forces, a capacity for states to protect their own production, and there would be control over multinationals. Now, this fell through. It was never implemented. We entered the counter-revolution, the neoliberal counter-revolution. The 1980s were a moment where southern countries were hit by the debt crisis. And it is also a moment when the United States decided to change the system. I'm not going to go into details, but that is the moment when the United States decides that the dollar is no longer going to be convertible, and the equilibrium that had been decided upon in Bretton Woods is put topsy-turvy. So what I mean to say, presenting all this about what I've been calling the Old South, is that emergence of a southern groupings of countries was a criticism of the system that the North had been building, and the claim that that system needed to be put down, with the hope that perhaps multilateral organization would help to do that. And 1973 is the demonstration that this will not happen. What do we see today? I think, I'm not going to go into details because I think we're going to do that later on, but we don't see that proposal to criticize free trade, capitalism. On the contrary, it seems that the rise of the South today oftentimes proposes to take the lead from countries that have decided to turn their back on free trade and the development not development, but free trade as it had been defended by the North up until now.
Yeah, if we go back in time, Martin, what happened to southern countries that attempted to kind of break their ties, break their economic dependence with the North?
Well, Renaud laid out very well the attempts that were made to create the non-aligned movement in 1961 and United Nations Conference on Trade and Development in 63, and then most importantly, this demand for new international economic order. And kind of the leverage that the South had was in 73, OPEC countries raised the price of oil very high, and they did it for two reasons. One is because the West had controlled oil and essentially kept the price of crude down and used it to import oil cheaply and refine it and sell it back. And so OPEC countries were struggling. The price had been kept for a decade way down. And second, there was a war when Egypt and Syria were trying to reclaim lands that Israel had taken from them in 67. And the West was very worried about the rise of oil prices. And they kept trying to get OPEC, you got to agree, let's plan this. And Algeria was the head of the non-aligned movement and a major player in OPEC. And it got OPEC to agree that it would not negotiate the price of oil separately, but there had to be a commitment to allow other cartels of third world countries to protect the price of their primary commodities and give them a chance, in fact, to internalize more of the production. And so this was kind of a struggle. And what happened, of course, is the world economy went into a recession that lasted until 75. The demand for oil went down. OPEC started to split with some of the more conservative countries like Saudi Arabia. And then, as Renaud pointed out, a big debt crisis hit, and all the leverage that the third world had to that time was lost. Countries like Mexico and Brazil were about to go bankrupt, and they were desperate for any aid, and therefore would accept opening up their economies and accept the kind of neoliberal policies. And so the movement kind of dissolved because it wasn't able to maintain its solidarity, and it was trying to force the change. It wasn't trying to collectively de-link, but it was trying to force a change in the global economy. And there are all sorts of interesting models. I'm just going to say one that comes to mind. When the IMF was being developed, there was a proposal that if a government said we don't want capital flight, which is something that, as Renaud was talking about, the wealthy elites who make money and then they don't want to keep it in the country. If a government said there's capital flight, and it went from Mozambique to France, and I said it's illegal, according to the rules of the IMF, the French banks would have to return it. So there's an example of a powerful international institution that adds to the capacity of states rather than what we have now, which are international institutions which undermine the capacities of states in the third world. And this was kind of the battle, and the third world did not have the unity or the collective leverage to force the developed capitalist countries to accept things.
Or when they tried to unite on the question of the debt, there was definite efforts by the North to prevent them from doing this, by signing bilateral agreements.
Yes, they'd offer lower interest rates if you agreed to do this.
If you don't get together,
Yeah.
How about the alternative put forward after that, more recently? What can you say a few words about those?
Alternatives
to try to destroy the ties, or to at least take some distance with this dependence relationship with the North?
Well, there was one we wanted to talk about, which was the Yasuni experience in Ecuador. In 2006, Rafael Correa was elected, and Guillaume Long, whom some of you might have listened to, was Minister for Foreign Affairs under that presidency. And in 2008, Correa proposed the following thing. Ecuador is an oil exporting country, and oil is one of the main revenues for Ecuador. And Ecuador is also a country where you have tropical forest, pristine tropical forest. And there is this park called the Yasuni Park, very rich with oil, but very rich with biodiversity as well. And in 2008, Korea offered the international community a deal. Ecuador will not extract oil and destroy that biodiversity if the international community agrees to pay Ecuador half the sum we would have made if we had sold that oil. So basically the idea was, okay, we need to develop our resources, oil at the moment, but we understand that biodiversity in Ecuador is important to the entire planet, so this is a shared responsibility. If you're willing to do this, we'll try another way of developing. We'll develop new technology. We'll try and substitute exports, but give us some money. But 2008, of course, is also the date of the subprime crisis. And a lot of countries entered into difficulty at that time. And in 2011, Ecuador had received $3 million when the sum that it had required was $100 million. So this is an example of a situation where I think a southern country offers a reasonable deal, a shared responsibility in the global struggle against climate change, and the North was not ready to take its share of the load.
Yeah. And the other example I wanted to offer, that is one of the biggest tragedies, actually, you know, the example you gave with Ecuador, just because now they're developing it.
Absolutely.
Is ALBA, which was it was the Bolivarian Alliance for Latin America. And it was an attempt by a number of countries, Venezuela, Bolivia, and Cuba were the core drivers, but there were several other countries, a number of Caribbean countries as well. And so this grew out of the US was always attempting to promote a free trade, and they had the free trade area of the Americas they want, which would open up all the Americas to US capital, and this was a resistance to that. And their vision was a little bit like the European Payments Union that I mentioned, to think about how to do a collective delinking, but support each other. And one of the problems of getting out from the global economy is a country alone, it's really hard to do that. You don't have the resources, you don't have the markets, but if you collectively, like Europe did, then there's a way to build a wider market and to work together. So the idea was to build ALBA-wide public enterprises. And so they built a media system, television and print, so that the different countries could feed into, and there would be a media source that would represent them and their reporters and their view of things. They tried to do things like, for example, Cuba was really advanced in healthcare, but Cuba couldn't produce all the things it needed for healthcare. So what if we got other countries to produce the buses or ambulances, or other countries like Venezuela had a bigger construction industry, so it could do construction. And what you would do then is to create a region-wide healthcare system that everyone would benefit from, the drugs and the medical education, but it would be collectively rooted so that all the countries would also have a stake in it. And the idea was Venezuela said, let's build a shipping industry. We have experience with oil. Why should we have foreign ships come in and take oil around? And so the idea was to kind of build this collective, and they were even moving towards a currency called the sucre, where countries took their currencies, converted into sucres, and eventually this bank would provide loans. And so this was an effort to kind of look at food, healthcare, education, and energy were going to be kind of the drivers of a regional process that would be organized according to public enterprises, in most cases jointly owned public enterprises. They went as far as talking about you need an all the social movement groups who would try and keep things kind of responsive to people on the ground. Unfortunately, the decisions were made by elites at the top, and the social movement groups weren't that active, but a lot of the effort was financed by Venezuela and high oil prices. And when oil prices went down, Venezuela didn't have the resources, economic conditions made it hard, and so there was only limited gains. ALBA still exists, but it's kind of a shell of itself in terms of its vision. But that was kind of a vision, of thinking about how third world countries could work together and develop, ways of raising populations by their own collective capacities.
So against all this historical background, what's your definition of the global south? Is this term appropriate at all? And how does it relate to the rise of the BRICS?
Perhaps we should say a couple of words on the BRICS. And Martin, if you don't mind, I switch to French. Les BRICS, le concept de BRICS, vous le savez peut-être, émerge en 2001 sous la plume d'un analyste de la banque Goldman Sachs qui s'appelle Jim O'Neill. Et il échafaude cet acronyme pour évoquer les pays qui, selon lui, vont tirer la croissance mondiale en 2001. En 2010, on a demandé à Jim O'Neill comment il adapterait son acronyme s'il devait le faire. Et Jim O'Neill a répondu: aujourd'hui, l'acronyme ne serait plus BRICS, ce serait C pour Chine. Mais il a dit, admittedly, this would not be a good acronym. Il me semble que cette anecdote nous souligne le fait que ce que l'on a associé à l'émergence des BRICS, l'émergence économique des BRICS, c'est avant tout l'émergence de la Chine. Dans la manière de voir dont nous avons parlé tout à l'heure, nous avons un graphe qui montre l'évolution du PIB, de la part du PIB, donc de la production de richesse des pays des BRICS, entre 2010 et 2020. Et donc, pour vous, la courbe va croissante. C'est-à-dire que cette part augmente. Nous avons un deuxième graphe dans lequel on établit la même courbe, mais en retranchant la Chine des pays des BRICS. La courbe est totalement plate. C'est-à-dire que l'explosion économique des BRICS, comme le suggère la remarque ironique de Jim O'Neill, est en fait l'explosion économique de la Chine. Mais l'émergence des BRICS n'est pas uniquement une émergence économique, c'est aussi une émergence politique. Et celle-là a lieu à un moment très particulier, ça a lieu au moment de la crise des subprimes. La crise des subprimes est un événement absolument clé dans l'histoire de notre modèle économique. Pour ceux qui ne l'ont pas vécu, parce que je vois des têtes assez jeunes ici, c'est un effondrement total du système économique, financier, de dérégulation qui avait été construit à vitesse grand V à partir de cette contre-révolution néolibérale dont j'ai parlé, mais notamment le début des années 90. Tout s'écroule parce que le capital fictif sur lequel reposait l'idée de cette dérégulation, eh bien, on s'aperçoit qu'il n'existe pas. À cette époque-là, les pays du Sud, dont il est question, disent à leurs interlocuteurs du Nord: très bien, jusqu'à maintenant nous avons suivi vos consignes, vous nous avez emmenés droit dans le mur, désormais on va mettre nous aussi notre main sur le volant. Qu'est-ce que le volant du pilotage économique mondial? C'est le Conseil des gouverneurs du Fonds monétaire international, principalement. Or, le Conseil des gouverneurs du Fonds monétaire international repose sur une distribution des pouvoirs assez singulière. Les droits de vote de chacun des pays au sein de ce Conseil sont répartis en fonction de la somme d'argent que les pays ont versé au moment de la construction du fonds. Sans surprise, les États-Unis ont un poids considérable, puisqu'au moment de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, à la fin de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, en 1944, lorsqu'est créé le Fonds monétaire international, les États-Unis détiennent, je crois, plus de 2/3 du stock d'or de la planète. Et donc, les États-Unis disposent du seul droit de veto au sein du Fonds monétaire international, puisqu'ils sont le seul pays à avoir un droit de vote supérieur à 15%. Or, pour qu'une décision soit prise par le Conseil des gouverneurs du FMI, il faut qu'il soit accepté à plus de 85%. si les États-Unis ne votent pas, eh bien la décision n'est pas acceptée. 2009, 2010, lors d'une réunion du G20, les pays du Sud demandent une révision des droits de vote au sein du Fonds monétaire international. Mettre les mains sur le volant. Les pays du Nord acceptent l'idée de cette révision qui prendra 6 ans pour advenir. Lors de la révision des droits de vote, la modification, je ne vous livre pas les chiffres, la modification est tellement minime, c'est-à-dire que les États-Unis conservent leur veto, la part de la Chine passe de 3 à 6%, seuls les pays européens perdent une partie de leur pouvoir de décision. À ce moment-là, les pays du Sud comprennent qu'il ne sera pas possible de modifier l'attitude des pays du Nord au sein des organisations multilatérales. Et c'est de là que découle la création des BRICS et l'émergence de cette revendication politique d'une construction de la mondialisation à côté des outils de construction de la mondialisation sous hégémonie américaine. Mais à quelle fin construire cette mondialisation? Eh bien là, il me semble qu'il est intéressant de regarder le document de travail qui a été soumis aux pays des BRICS lors de la réunion de Kazan en 2024. L'un des points importants de cette réunion était la question monétaire. Donc, la question monétaire au centre des préoccupations de la construction du modèle économique mondial. Eh bien, ce document de travail était un document dans lequel le terme inégalité était présent 0 fois. Le terme pauvreté était présent 2 fois. Les termes marché de capitaux étaient présents 26 fois. Et le terme investissement était présent 89 fois. Ce qui me semble illustrer la nature des réflexions qui sont conduites par les BRICS. Lorsque vous discutez aujourd'hui avec des dirigeants de pays tels que la Chine, ou lorsque vous entendez leurs discours, leur propos n'est pas de mettre à terre la logique interne qui a conduit à la mondialisation libre-échangiste que nous connaissons aujourd'hui et qui a conduit au désastre de la crise des subprimes. Leur projet est de participer au pilotage de ce système sans en changer la logique interne de fonctionnement. Aujourd'hui, la Chine ne veut pas mettre à terre l'Organisation mondiale du commerce. Elle reproche aux États-Unis de ne pas en respecter les décisions. La Chine ne veut pas mettre à terre le Fonds monétaire international. Elle veut pouvoir avoir un droit de vote qui soit équivalent à celui des États-Unis, ou légèrement inférieur. La Chine ne veut pas remettre en cause les accords de libre-échange. Elle en signe tout un tas avec tout un tas de pays. Et donc, pour conclure, la différence que nous souhaitons souligner dans cette manière de voir entre un Sud qui remettait en cause ses logiques internes de fonctionnement du système économique mondial sous hégémonie du Nord, et principalement des États-Unis, ce Sud est très différent de celui que l'on observe aujourd'hui, qui conteste le pilotage d'un système sans en contester la logique interne.
Martin, to put it very succinctly, Renaud argued that the rise of the South is largely the rise of China. So my question for you is, do you agree? Does China actually represent a potential alternative to US hegemony, or does it not actually reproduce the very same kind of capitalist development?
I would say the latter. And Renaud is smiling, so I have a feeling that we shared that. I was going to ask the audience if there's anything I needed to object to. Unfortunately, China it's clear it's seeking a place in the global capitalist system. It's trying to restructure its position. And I think the rise of the BRICS is really a story of China. And you probably mentioned this, but the BRICS created something that was supposed to replace the IMF, a currency reserve system. And according to the currency reserve system, if you would have, if you needed to borrow too much money, you had to go to the IMF and get their approval before the BRICS currency reserve system would loan you any money. But you know what? The currency reserve system has been set up since 2015. It's never given a penny out. There's a BRICS bank. It funds itself through dollars. China has sought, and the BRICS have sought more standing in the World Bank and the IMF, but at the expense of other countries of the South. They lose voting shares while some of the BRICS countries get voting shares. I think that unfortunately, the BRICS and China in particular as the leader, have not really pioneered an alternative system or created kind of a process that would really strengthen the countries of the global south in changing the way the system operates.
Well, we have turned to, with the topic of China, to East Asia. So perhaps we can, and we're getting close to the conclusion of this roundtable. So perhaps we could talk about the reaction of the North towards this rise of China, especially in this East Asian region. And South Korea has been in the news a lot over the last 2 days with this attempted coup by the President Sung-yeon. Could you perhaps provide us kind of a historical recap of the situation in South Korea since reunification in terms of its geopolitical and military dynamics?
Yeah.
And,
I think I'm going to do a little history, but as a kind of overall framework, the U.S. has looked towards Korea as a really important country, close to Russia, close to China, touching the mainland, close to Japan, and so it's very important. And until recently, the U.S. used its anti-North Korean policy, its claims of North Korea as a threat to the world, as a way of maintaining bases in Japan. That was the main story. We need to protect you. The U.S. has has operational control over the South Korean military, and it was said to, fight North Korea. Lately, because of the conflict with with China, where the U.S. now sees China as a major competitor economically, it's using the kind of institutions it's set up and as kind of the militarism it's set up to reorient a bit now towards threatening China. And so let me just kind of back up with terms of Korea. When World War II was coming to an end, the U.S. thought it was going to have to, in the Pacific, invade Japan. And it asked the Soviet Union, would you take on the Japanese troops in Korea and Manchuria, which were some of the toughest troops? And the Soviet Union said, yep, 3 months after the end of the war in Europe, we're going after the Japanese troops. And the U.S. said, great. What happened is that the U.S. did not enjoy having to share the peace arrangements with the Soviet Union and Germany. And it was nervous about what would happen if the Soviet Union got into the war against Japan. So when it had the atom bomb, it decided to try and force Japan to surrender quickly before the Soviet Union got in the war. So it dropped the bomb really almost 3 months to the day that the Soviets started to move down Korea and into Manchuria. And the Japanese took a little time before they surrendered, so the U.S. dropped another bomb. When the Japanese surrendered, the Soviet Union was moving down to Korea, and the U.S. didn't want to lose Korea because of its importance. So 2 officers put in a room, and they came up with a parallel to divide North from South. And the U.S. announced unilaterally that it would take the surrender of Japanese troops in the south of this parallel, which gave the U.S. Seoul and the majority of the population. No one knew what the Soviets would do. This is mid-October, mid-August, and the U.S. wouldn't get to actually have troops in Korea for another 2 weeks. Soviets agreed and stopped. Within Korea, the Koreans who had been fighting the Japanese took advantage of Japan's surrender and created committees for the preparation of Korean independence, seized Japanese property, built labor unions, built peasant unions, and before the U.S. arrived, announced that they had the Korean People's Republic. With the support of independent unions, the support of peasants' unions, women's movements. When the U.S. got to the South, it very quickly ruled them illegal, threw most of their leaders in jail, maintained the same Koreans who had worked for the Japanese in positions of power, and essentially divided the country with two different development processes going on. Because in the north, the Soviets allowed the Korean People's Republic that was operating there to continue with land reform and reform of all sorts of labor conditions and so on and so forth. As this is happening, the US brings in Syngman Rhee, who was outside of Korea, who was an anti-communist but wasn't a Japanese collaborator, and created a separate South Korea because they couldn't control North Korea. They decided they would control South Korea, so they created a separate country. The North responded by creating a North Korea. And for a year, this is even agreed to by the West and US, South Korea, Syngman Rhee sent troops over into the North to try and initiate a fight, hoping to bring the US in and to get all of Korea. To make a long story short, the Korean War happens. I'm not going to go into all the details, it's complicated, but here's what's interesting. When the Korean War ended, there was a Geneva meeting. The Geneva meeting was supposed to be to reunify Korea. The North Koreans said, let's get neutral nations together and have an election for a new Korean government. Everyone votes. And the US refused. The US said, no, only an election in the North controlled by the UN, which had just been fighting for 3 years. The conference ended with North and South separate. In 1958, the US introduced nuclear weapons into South Korea. War games that threatened the North with nuclear attack. North Korea had no nuclear weapons. In the late 80s, early 90s, the US feared that North Korea was now developing its own nuclear capacity. So they said, we want to know what's going on. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and North Korea, which had depended on the Soviet Union for trade, was now in big trouble. And so the North Koreans said to the United States, we're not telling you if we have nuclear weapons, but we'll let you come and observe and see, and we'll get rid of whatever you don't like if you agree to normalize relations and stop being our enemy. Because the North Koreans didn't think that the US was going to help them, but without the embargoes and the assaults, then the North thought it could make trade relations with Europe and other countries. The US said no. And Bill Clinton, who was president then, was prepared to attack North Korea. And plans for a military invasion were in gear until Jimmy Carter, who was a former president of the United States, went to North Korea, met Kim Il-sung, and came up with an agreement. And because he didn't trust the US, he went on CNN to announce it before telling the United States, because he feared that if he told the US, they would put it aside and attack. That agreement lasted from 1994 to 2002. North Korea froze all of its nuclear weapons and put all the nuclear material under international agreement. And the agreement was that the US would build 2 light water reactors to replace the energy needs and some oil to help North Korea deal with its energy crisis because the Soviet Union was gone. The US didn't send the oil, and the 2 reactors which were supposed to be built by 2003, the cement foundation of only one was laid by 2002. And the US admits that they thought North Korea was going to collapse. They didn't care. 2001, George Bush said, axis of evil, North Korea is terrible, we cancel the agreement. So what did North Korea do? It started its nuclear program. 2003, the Chinese, worried, brings people together and says, we need to get some peace. And so there's a big meeting. The US doesn't want to go. The Chinese say, if you don't go, we're going to say you're the problem here. So they get into an agreement, almost the same agreement that they had before. The day it's signed, the next day after it's signed, the US says, North Korea is counterfeiting $100 bills, and that's a threat to our national security. The agreement's off. And so what did North Korea do? It exploded a nuclear bomb. And the next day, the US said, okay, forget the counterfeiting, let's negotiate. And they signed an agreement. And the North said, again, normalization, some help, and we will destroy our nuclear infrastructure. And you can witness it, international people back. The US then reneged on that agreement. It went down into a 4-step. By step 3, Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State, says, yeah, we're moving the goalposts. We now want you to give up missile development. We want to have inspections anywhere in North Korean military, unannounced. It collapsed. The North Koreans detonated another nuclear weapon. And this has been the condition where the US refuses the same demands that North Korea keeps making. Let's normalize relations. They don't even say remove troops from South Korea. Normalize relations, end embargo, allow us to be an open, free country to make deals. And the US refuses. And the reason is that when the Soviet Union went, the US needed a rationale for its militarism. And so it said North Korea and Iraq. And Iraq kind of went. And so North Korea. And with that North Korea, it enabled the US to keep building its military, Star Wars, all these things, have troops on the Asian mainland under its control, keep troops in Japan. Also, whenever there's national security, it tends to shift the population to the right. So it would always raise the threat of North Korea to get a conservative in South Korea, conservatives in Japan, created all these problems. And this is continued. Now, it went back and forth. I'm not going to go through all the things, but the North's response was, we want to negotiate. When you don't, we're going to force you to the table by continuing to develop our nuclear capacities. Now, North Korea says we're not going to give them up anymore, but we won't build new ones if you accept us and negotiate. But the US now has another enemy, which is China. And so what the US is doing is it's forcing the South Korean president, who may be on his way out, for trying to make a coup in South Korea and declare martial law. The US got that president to agree to work with Japan and create an alliance of US, South Korea, and Japan to essentially not to defend South Korea, not to defend Japan, but to ensure the Indo-Pacific region is safe. The US got South Korea to go to Jeju, which is a beautiful island called the Island of Peace, rip it up and build a naval base that is aimed for US Navy to project submarine and other power towards China. The US put THAAD missiles, claiming it's for North Korea, but the trajectory of North Korean missiles would never be picked up. It's against China. And so what the US is now doing is kind of piggybacking their determination. I'm not saying they want war, but they're willing to play with fire here to keep the pressure up on North Korea and to use that to now talk about the need to, what they say is, they've got NATO saying China is a major threat to the peace of the world. They've taken the troops that were in South Korea and the UN troops, and they're now integrating Japan. They're trying to remilitarize Japan, all directed now towards trying to create a world situation where China's isolated, North Korea is isolated, and the US can assert through its military dominance and economic dominance in the region. So it's very dangerous, and it's driven by the US in that sense.
And what are the social and political consequences of all this military buildup for the people in the region?
Well, war is never good for the people, is it? But if you allow me, I'll make a comment on the rise of China, which feeds into what Martin was saying. Because the problem for the United States is not that China is proposing something different, it's that China has become better than the United States at the United States game. And there was a very important speech made by Jake Sullivan, who is advisor for national security, in April of 2023. And it was a speech on the economy from an advisor on national security. And what Jake Sullivan said in as many words as this is that it's the end of the Washington Consensus. Now, you might remember that the Washington Consensus is a set of policies put forward in early 1990s that promoted free trade, deregulation, privatization, you name it. Now, this is over, said Jack Sullivan, because it hasn't served the American people. He explained, But really, what he meant is that it served China a lot better than they expected. The idea was that opening up to China, allowing China to join the World Trade Organization, was going to lead to political changes in China. China was going to be one of the good guys. But the Chinese, they took benefit of that opening, and they built a system, and they have become better than the United States at the United States game. So the Washington consensus does no longer hold, which means that the economy and the rules of the proper economy, orthodox economy, what we've been fed with, the idea that you need to open your markets in order to reach prosperity, this we kind of knew, but this was only a way of asserting US domination over the world. Now, once this is being threatened, the United States still has one powerful weapon, which is the army. And with the rise of China and the increased tension between Washington and Beijing, what we see is the emergence of that concept, Indo-Pacific, which Martin has been talking about, which again, like the South, is presenting itself as a geographic description of the world. There is such a thing as the Indian Ocean, such a thing as the Pacific Ocean. If you put the two regions together, then you have the Indo-Pacific. But really what the Indo-Pacific is doing, it's organizing the world around a conflict. Indo-Pacific is the name of the war that's coming. And I'm not sure that the United States is not wishing for a war now, better than later when China is even stronger. I wouldn't put my hand in the fire about this. So we have this rise of the Indo-Pacific, which is presenting China as the main threat. And some of you might be on French social networks, Twitter and everything. And there is this map. I was telling Martin about it when we were walking around earlier on today or yesterday. Anyway, there's this map of Indo-Pacific that has been circulating on Twitter. And it shows China in the center and American naval bases all around China. And the comment is, look at how aggressive China is, putting their country right beside American bases. And I think that's where we're at the moment, where the economy and all the questions related to development are secondary to national security. It is a national security advisor, US security advisor, who is giving a speech on the economy. And I don't think, to conclude, that can be a good thing for the people.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Martin. Thank you very much, Renaud, for this great roundtable.